The world of prisons is a brutal and unforgiving environment where survival often hinges on one's ability to assert dominance or defend oneself against relentless threats. Among the most savage prison fights are those that go beyond mere scuffles and become life-or-death battles, determining who walks away and who is left broken or worse. These fights are not just about physical strength but also about psychological warfare, where inmates use fear, intimidation, and sheer willpower to establish their place in the prison hierarchy. In many cases, these confrontations are premeditated, with inmates planning their moves carefully to maximize damage and send a clear message to others. The stakes are always high, and the consequences are often permanent, leaving scars both visible and hidden. 2. One of the most infamous prison fights took place in a maximum security facility where two rival gang leaders clashed over control of the prison's underground economy. The fight began in the yard, where tensions had been simmering for weeks, and quickly escalated into a full-blown brawl involving makeshift weapons. Shanks crafted from toothbrushes and sharpened pieces of metal were wielded with deadly precision, leaving both men bloodied and battered. The fight lasted for nearly 15 minutes, with neither inmate willing to back down, until one finally collapsed from blood loss. The victor, though severely injured, solidified his dominance, while the loser was rushed to the infirmary, never to regain his former status. 3. In another harrowing incident, a new inmate was targeted by a group of seasoned prisoners who saw him as an easy mark. The new arrival, however, had a military background and was trained in hand-to-hand combat. When the group cornered him in the showers, he fought back with a ferocity that stunned his attackers. Using a combination of martial arts and sheer desperation, he managed to incapacitate two of his assailants before the guards intervened. The fight left the new inmate with a broken rib and a reputation as someone not to be trifled with, while the attackers were left humiliated and nursing their wounds. 4. Prison fights often take place in areas where surveillance is minimal, such as cell blocks, showers, or secluded corners of the yard. These locations provide the perfect cover for inmates to settle scores without immediate intervention from guards. One such fight occurred in a dimly lit cell block where two inmates had been feuding over a personal grievance. The confrontation began with verbal taunts but quickly turned physical when one inmate lunged at the other with a homemade blade. The fight was brutal and chaotic, with both men sustaining serious injuries before other inmates stepped in to break it up. By the time the guards arrived, one inmate was unconscious, and the other was barely standing, his face a mask of blood. 5. The psychological toll of prison fights cannot be overstated. Inmates who survive these brutal encounters often suffer from PTSD, anxiety, and depression, knowing that another fight could break out at any moment. For some, the trauma of surviving a savage fight is compounded by the constant fear of retaliation. In one case, an inmate who had won a particularly vicious fight found himself looking over his shoulder for months, waiting for the other man's allies to seek revenge. The stress of living in such a volatile environment can drive even the toughest individuals to the brink of madness, leading to further violence and instability. 6. Weapons play a significant role in many prison fights, with inmates crafting shanks, clubs, and other improvised tools to gain an edge over their opponents. These weapons are often hidden in cleverly concealed locations, such as inside mattresses, under floor tiles, or even in body cavities. In one notorious incident, an inmate used a shank made from a piece of broken glass to slash his opponent's face during a fight in the cafeteria. The attack was so swift and unexpected that the victim didn't even have time to react before he was left with a deep, disfiguring wound. The attacker was immediately subdued by guards, but the damage had been done, and the victim was left permanently scarred. 7. The role of gangs in prison fights cannot be ignored, as these groups often orchestrate violence to maintain control or settle disputes. Gang-related fights are typically more organized and brutal, with multiple members participating to ensure their side emerges victorious. In one instance, a fight between two rival gangs erupted in the yard, involving over a dozen inmates armed with shanks, chains, and other weapons. The chaos was so intense that the guards had to use tear gas and riot gear to restore order. By the time the dust settled, several inmates were seriously injured, and one was dead, his body riddled with stab wounds. 8. The aftermath of a prison fight is often just as brutal as the fight itself, with inmates facing disciplinary action, solitary confinement, or even criminal charges. For those who survive, the physical and emotional scars serve as a constant reminder of the violence they endured. In one case, an inmate who had been involved in a particularly savage fight was placed in solitary confinement for months, leaving him isolated and mentally shattered. When he was finally released back into the general population, he was a shadow of his former self, unable to cope with the trauma of his experience. 9. The culture of violence in prisons is perpetuated by a combination of factors, including overcrowding, lack of resources, and the constant struggle for power. In such an environment, fights are not just inevitable but often necessary for survival. Inmates who refuse to fight risk being seen as weak and becoming targets for exploitation or abuse. This pressure to prove oneself can lead to increasingly violent confrontations, as inmates try to establish their dominance and protect themselves from harm. In one case, an inmate who had avoided conflict for years was finally forced to fight when he was cornered by a group of bullies. The fight was short but brutal, leaving the inmate with a broken nose and a newfound reputation as someone who wouldn't back down. 10. The role of race in prison fights is another complex and often contentious issue. In many prisons, racial lines are sharply drawn, with inmates forming alliances based on ethnicity or nationality. These alliances can lead to violent clashes when tensions between groups boil over. In one instance, a fight between two racial groups broke out in the mess hall, sparked by a perceived insult. The fight quickly escalated, with inmates using trays, utensils, and whatever else they could find as weapons. The guards struggled to contain the chaos, and by the time order was restored, several inmates were injured, and the mess hall was left in shambles. 11. The use of psychological tactics in prison fights is just as important as physical strength. Inmates often use intimidation, threats, and manipulation to gain an advantage over their opponents. In one case, an inmate spread rumors about his rival's supposed weakness, causing others to view the man as an easy target. When the two finally clashed, the psychological warfare had already taken its toll, leaving the rival hesitant and unsure. The fight was over almost before it began, with the instigator emerging victorious and his opponent left humiliated and broken. 12. The impact of prison fights extends beyond the individuals involved, affecting the entire prison population. Witnessing a savage fight can leave inmates traumatized and on edge, knowing that they could be next. In one case, a fight in the yard left several inmates so shaken that they refused to leave their cells for days, fearing for their safety. The prison administration was forced to increase security and offer counseling services to help inmates cope with the aftermath, but the damage had already been done. 13. The role of guards in prison fights is often a contentious issue, with some inmates accusing them of turning a blind eye to violence or even encouraging it. In one instance, a fight broke out in a cell block while guards allegedly stood by and watched, only intervening after the fight had reached a critical point. The inmates involved were left with serious injuries, and the incident sparked outrage among the prison population, leading to protests and demands for accountability. 14. The use of drugs in prison fights is another disturbing trend, with some inmates using substances like PCP or methamphetamine to enhance their aggression and pain tolerance. In one case, an inmate high on PCP attacked another inmate with a shank, stabbing him repeatedly despite sustaining multiple injuries himself. The fight was so brutal that it took several guards to subdue the attacker, who continued to struggle even after being restrained. The victim was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, while the attacker was placed in solitary confinement. 15.